This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. After 2 episodes that were primarily focused on broad conceptual ideas about women's relationship to their Judaism and to their status in halacha, we are shifting to discuss a topic that is timely, and that is the 9 days and the upcoming fast of Tisha Bav. We will talk about some of the halachic issues as they apply to and are experienced by women, and also about how we can connect to the significance of these days. We remind you that for specific halachic details, it's best to check out the relevant Deracheha articles. You can find the links in the show notes. And for Psak Halacha, you can consult individually with your halachic authority.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shayna.
It's good to be back here with you and to begin our first conversation about a more specific topic, even though it's actually a heavy one to be starting with. This episode is going to be released in the middle of the 9 days, which are part of a bigger time period that's known as the 3 weeks, which begins with the fast on Shvasar B'Tammuz, the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, which marks a few different tragedies in our people's history, including the breaching of the walls in Yerushalayim. And we'll end with the upcoming fast of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, when both the first and the second temple, the Beit HaMikdash, were destroyed. Not an easy time.
No, not at all. And we often hear people refer to these 3 weeks as Ben HaMetzarim. This phrase is lifted from the beginning of Megillat Eicha, from the first chapter and the third pasuk. And there the pasuk says, Kol rodfea hisiguha ben hametzarim. All of her pursuers overtook her between the straits. The image of this pasuk is actually of people fleeing. Rashi says that they're caught between the borders of their fields and of their vineyards. It's really an image of people fleeing the death trap of Yerushalayim. But Chazal take this phrase and they use it to refer to the 3 weeks, because this is sort of when we are caught between our different tragedies that ultimately ended with destruction.
Yeah, and you could often feel that certain nervous tension in the air in our communities during this time, this cautiousness or this concern that bad things could happen or what's going to be during the 3 weeks this year. There's this sense that the entire 3 weeks are thought of as an inauspicious and threatening time of distress, when forces of destruction are more prevalent. What we are going to be talking today is specifically the 9 days, which begin halfway, a little bit more than halfway through this time period. Both the Mishnah and the Gemara describe that even though the entire 3 weeks is thought of as a time of mourning, the mourning actually escalates in stages. And for Ashkenazim, that real escalation happens on Rosh Chodesh Av with increased practices of mourning, which jives with the Mishnah and Tanit that tells us Mishenechnas Av Ma'atim B'Simcha, that with the arrival of we decrease our happiness. For Sephardim, though, many poskim actually hold that these stringencies only kick in during the actual calendar week leading up to Tisha B'Av, what we like to call the Shavua Shachar Bo, the week that Tisha B'Av actually falls. Which this year it's interesting because Tisha B'Av is on Motzei Shabbat, on a Saturday night and Sunday. There actually is no Shavua Shachar Bo. So many of the stringencies that we're going to be talking about in today's episode won't apply to all of our listeners, specifically to Sephardim this year, in the same way that they usually would.
I think that either way, I think that this prism that Rav Soloveitchik offered, I learned this definitely when I was a really, really young person. I can't remember when I was first exposed to it. But the prism that he offers, where we talk about Avilut Yeshena and Avilut Chadasha, are very, very relevant. That essentially he says that the 3 weeks and the way that the process builds up to Tisha B'Av essentially kind of mimics stages of mourning for a parent. And that the 3 weeks really correspond to the 12 months of mourning, or what we call Yud Bet Chodesh, where I would say there definitely are limitations, but it's not the same emotional intensity that one experiences in the beginning of when someone immediately dies. And so, there are limits on haircutting and different kinds of grooming. There are many customs, let's say, to not go to weddings, so not necessarily halachic in that same way, but maybe we'll save that for a conversation about Avelut. Yeah. He really compares the 9 days to the first month, or what we often call shloshim, right? Those 30 days. And the Tisha B'Av, which for us is one day, is parallel to the Shiva itself, to the 7 days of mourning. The reason why he compares it specifically to a parent is because we know that for a sibling or other relatives, we don't have that same prolonged process. So he looks at it as really the parallel to the intensity that we have for a parent all year long. And so we see that there is an increasing of intensity of the different stringencies that we have, the different halachic limitations we have during the 3 weeks. And so that is one frame to look at the way this is. I think that the idea behind it is also so important, because as opposed to a family member who, in a normative circumstance where somebody is very sad that their family member has passed away, so there is that immediate sort of like hit of intensity when you have that loss, and over time we slowly process. And what Rav Soloveitchik points out is this idea that in the case of Avilut Yeshana, that there is this historic event that happened. We have to create the emotional setting, because many of us are not innately sad. We don't have that innate mourning or grief that we have more naturally with a family member. And so we go through this process, says Rav Soloveitchik, where we have to sort of create the emotional setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Meaning, when we talk about the Avilut process for a parent, we're talking about how to channel really intense emotions that you feel, and how to give space to them, and how to give room to them, and how to also help the community know how to interact with you and realize the process that you're going through. So there's this intense week of Shiva, and then slowly there's a decreasing or a more integration into regular life. Here we're moving in the opposite direction, because the point here isn't so much to channel the emotions. I think the point here is actually more to raise awareness, or to help us tap into some kind of feeling that maybe we don't naturally feel, and the halacha is trying to help us create that feeling or engender that kind of response that maybe isn't coming to us in the way that we would want it to.
Yeah, I just want to bring one quote from his piece. The halacha could not decree observance of mourning at once. The reawakening takes time. It transpires gradually. It will be absurd to start out with a practical observance of mourning before the experience had been reproduced and relived in all of its tragic, frightening magnitude. So we have the period between the Yud Zayin Tammuz and Tisha B'Av to kind of like build up to this experience, which is why for us, the stringencies sort of increase. Yeah. As you said before, in the Sephardi version or psak of halacha, it's sort of even more limited in terms of the time that we have those stringencies.
Right, so, but it's still there.
But it's still there, definitely.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of how the halacha is often very intuitively aware of what our needs are. Sometimes we don't feel that way, and sometimes it feels like something's out of sync, and sometimes we really do feel like the halacha understands that we can't just go from a regular summer day to Tisha Bav, kacha, from 1 minute to the next. We need some kind of slower build-up in terms of being able to enter into that process.
The process that Rav Soloveitchik sort of points out here, or that he sort of sketches for us, it reminds me of another element of mourning that we often talk about in stages, and those are what we often get called the stages of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. There's a lot of misnomers about it. People think that they're supposed to happen in a certain order. She never said that. That wasn't true. So it's not just like, oh, I'm different. No. For everybody, they happen in different ways. But the sort of the stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And again, we're not going to go too deep into all of them, but for anyone who's interested or hasn't heard of this frame, I really recommend checking it out, because grief, it means many different things. It doesn't always just mean losing a person. That was what she was mostly looking at, but people mourn all different kinds of things all the time. We mourn ideas, we mourn a loss of self, we mourn maybe a marriage that didn't work, right? We have all different ways that mourning shows up in our life. But then at some point, it does happen at sort of an end process, in air quotes, there's acceptance. Her Talmid Muvhak, her biggest student, who is a man named David Kessler. So he wrote a book called Finding Meaning, and he basically said that there's another stage, and that's the stage of meaning making. And Shayna, you and I have seen this literally in front of our face for definitely the past 2 years and even more than that. But I think people all over the world have observed this, that people very often want to find meaning in their loss. And so meaning could be that they find a higher purpose to it. Meaning could be that they make a nonprofit out of, in memory of, right? All these different ways that people create meaning. And I think that we'll circle back to what I think we've experienced in Israel in the past while with a tremendous amount of loss that we've seen. I just want to say in the religious context of the 9 days and the 3 weeks as a whole period, I think that most often people find the stage of meaning the most challenging. Meaning some people, I think, don't even have an expectation that they're going to feel, emotionally wrenched by the loss. It's very difficult to conjure up that feeling. But I think that most people are looking for meaning, and that is a challenge. But I think there also is a lot to say about how one can find meaning in this period of time.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking that a big part of finding meaning is the narrative that we build around a story, and like the framing and the way that we think about it is also so important. And we're definitely given a narrative, by Chazal and by our halacha, or by our Judaism in terms of how to approach these days. Part of that is the halachot that we're going to talk about that apply to these days, and the feeling that they're supposed to give us. Now, we don't have time, obviously, for an extensive conversation about all of them. And as you said, for that, people are invited to visit the relevant articles on the Deracheha website. But I do want to touch on areas that make a real impact on us and that do affect the way we experience these days, or do definitely contribute to the feelings that we have. For me, the halachot that personally affect me the most are the ones that are connected to music in all different forms, and to basic enjoyment and pleasure during this time. So it begins with a prohibition in the Talmud that tells us that weddings and engagement parties are prohibited from the beginning of the month of Av. By the way, not engagements themselves. You can get engaged throughout the 3 weeks, including on Tisha Bav. But we know that in terms of actual weddings and celebrations and music, the Shulchan Aruch follows suit and says, yes, weddings are prohibited during the 9 days. And the Rama, the Ashkenazi posek, extends this custom even to apply to the entire 3 weeks. So we know, especially as college teachers, that the 3 weeks all of a sudden is in summer is a time where, there's no weddings. And later authorities, such as the Magen Avraham, then expanded this ban on weddings to include other forms of celebrations, specifically all celebrations that involve music and dancing. What's interesting, though, is that they seem to be talking really about more public events, and they don't talk much about listening to music privately. It's much later authorities that come and say that we shouldn't listen to any live music during this time period, even privately, and then other poskim, like Rav Yosefa, for example, rule that we shouldn't even listen to most forms of recorded music as well. So for me, as somebody who really enjoys music, and in a family of, my kids, we enjoy music together, and we often have music on in the house, and certainly in the morning when everyone's getting up and getting ready, and when we're traveling in the car, especially in the summer when people are home more, or we're in the car more often, or we're driving long distances, we're going out for activities, to all of a sudden not have music on and not to be singing or in that relaxed casual mood as we usually are, really has a big impact. And when someone says to me 3 weeks, and especially 9 days, the first thing I think about is no music, and it could be because from when I was little, that was something that my parents were really makpid on, that we did not listen to music, even recorded music on a tape, a cassette. Back in the day, we did not have any music on in the car. But that all of a sudden, just day-to-day lacking of music in my life really helps me connect to the feelings of mourning and to this loss that we're supposed to tap into. And that, along with the fact that also it's the summer and there's other things that we're not really going to talk about now, but the fact that you're not supposed to go swimming and we're not at the beach during this time, or that typical summer carefree feeling. One thing that I've been thinking about over the last little while is that what's so interesting here is that the halacha, as I just said, is not really as stringent as most people think that it is, meaning that this ban on music is not really as absolute as sometimes it's spoken about, and therefore there's all kinds of poskim and discussions about maybe when we can't permit music, like for sure if you're in the car and you can't stay awake and you need music to keep you going, Rav Lichtenstein says that that's a time that you could put it on. Or if you're in an exercise class and you have music on for rhythm, or you're going through a hard period of time, like in Corona, Rav Schechter from YU said that people could listen to music if they need help just dealing with difficult melancholy feelings. Or Rav Melamed from Pnei Halacha even talks about that maybe it's just happy music that's ruled out, and maybe like sad music or music that's more appropriate for this time period isn't an issue at all, or certainly not, he says, maybe even happier music on Erev Shabbat or Motzei Shabbat. So it's one of those areas of halacha where on the one hand, it could be that some of us are practicing in a way that's not necessarily absolutely required from the halacha. And on the other hand, it's not something that I want to let go of so quickly. Even in discussions with my kids about should we put on a cappella music in the car, because there's all these groups now that put out music specifically for the 3 weeks that don't have any live instruments in the background. And we've kind of come to the conclusion of like, even though that might technically be allowed, is that the mood, is that the avirah, is that the atmosphere that we want to create for ourselves during this time period?
Yeah, I think that this is a great example of where what the actual halacha doesn't even matter so much.
Yeah.
Because the tool of not utilizing music, not benefiting from music, serves such an important purpose. In the broader scheme of all the halachot that apply to this time period, and I would say especially as women, we're like hair cutting. Okay, so most women anyways are not cutting their hair every month. So to pass by 3 weeks without cutting your hair isn't really such a big deal. A lot of the halachot are not. They're not so impactful on our lives, definitely as women, right? I think for men, many of them will say that the shaving piece is the marker for them. It's the thing that makes them slightly uncomfortable, right? It's the thing that reminds them what time period of the year they're in. And I think for men and women, but definitely in your example, music serves like a really significant educational, creating the environment, creating the atmosphere piece. But as we said, it's not really Ikar Hadin. And I will say that I definitely also grew up with, being taught that you weren't supposed to listen to any music. And when I did use it for, all different private purposes, I felt kind of bad.
Yeah.
And then I grew up and was like, oh, that's not really true. And
that's why it is important. Like, even though we just said like, yeah, the halacha doesn't really matter here because it's like maybe the mood or the atmosphere, it really also does, because that guilt feeling, or like, oh no, I'm in an exercise class and the teacher just put on music and maybe I should leave. It's like, it's okay, and knowing sometimes what the actual halacha requires of us is also important, even if we want to go beyond that.
Yeah, and I agree with you that in our house, we also, we have music on all the time in life, and we also curb it, even though I also am honest with my children and say, there's actually nothing wrong. Please don't judge your friends or whoever else is that they have music on, but to preserve a certain environment and to foster a certain environment, we're not going to leave it on. And maybe, we'll put on an Erev Shabbat.
That's another important piece though, the not judging.
Yeah, meaning I explained to him what the halacha is, and I also let them know like that we're doing X, in our family home. So I think that that's an interesting piece, and it goes well beyond the example of music in the 3 weeks, meaning when a halachic concept, even if it's not an obligatory concept, has a role in our religious life. But it's important to know, I think, what is halacha, right? What is at the base requirement versus what isn't, so that we can also make choices that are aware and knowledgeable, and also know when we have leniency that we can lean into when we need it in different moments.
Absolutely.
I really also think a lot about the topic of the grooming piece, which has many different elements to it, and those elements of halacha, about, as I mentioned before, about not getting haircuts and nail cutting, and different conversations about that, and shaving, and the use of makeup and perfume. Which again, there are many. Where you look at the articles on the website, there's a lot to say. There's a lot of room also to utilize these elements. We live in a society that places much more emphasis on hygiene hygiene and just body appearance definitely than was true in previous generations. And that definitely impacts the way that these ideas are spoken about in halacha. Today, because people are really overall more sensitive to, dirt and odor and sweat, and I'll just say the topic of showering, which seems to be pretty clear cut that you're not supposed to be showering in warm water. When you go back and look at those sources, they're really speaking about bathing for pleasure, which, by the way, whenever I see that phrase, Shayna, I always laugh because I don't think I've ever, first of all, in Israel, taking baths is not, I had this conversation in the realm of Hilchonida with people before, but baths for pleasure is not a concept in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think it probably roots back to like use of water in this country.
Totally. And when you have kids, who has time for bathing for pleasure?
Exactly. I just like laugh when I read the phrase bathing for pleasure. I don't even know what that means,
right.
honestly.
But you're saying they weren't talking about the shower to like get rid of the, sweatiness
Correct.
of the day.
Exactly. And so most modern poskim say that it's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. And there are those who say, well, you can be strict and not bathe in warm water during the 9 days. But there are many poskim who say that it's perfectly fine to bathe in warm water, but maybe it should be slightly shorter than usual. Again, it's this question of how are you
a little colder than usual, a little shorter than usual.
Yeah, like how are you marking this time? In the end of the day, bottom line, a person can shower in the way that we shower today, which is considered daily functioning, because it's not a for pleasure activity. It's just, so maybe if someone usually takes, 3 showers a day in their summertime, so maybe it's a good idea to take one less shower, meaning to have something in that routine that is a nod to the mourning of this.
Even though I'll just say there are people who are very makpid on this, maybe more makpid than they should be, but it's still meaning even with all the talk of today's modern poskim of like, of course you could shower, there's still a lot of people that make an effort really not to shower as much as they usually would because it's the 9 days.
Right. I salute them. The truth is, though, I also wanted to bring up one other piece, which I know is super impactful on my daily life as the laundry doer in the family. And in every family, that responsibility divides up differently, but that is 100% my responsibility in my home. And also here, we have conversations about laundering clothes. Can one do laundry in the 9 days? And can one wear clothing that is clean, meaning
freshly
laundered clothing? And here, again, we have sort of this spectrum of ideas that everything from one shouldn't do, any laundry during the 9 days, not from the 3 weeks, during the 9 days, and that we shouldn't wear freshly laundered clothes. And we also have, there's definitely a leniency when it comes to children that already is in the Shulchan Aruch and the Rema about doing laundry of children's clothing to make sure that they have enough. Obviously, this doesn't mean that there's a requirement to have 15 pairs of pants, right? That's not what we're talking about here, although sometimes it can get warped into that kind of idea. But I just want to bring up one thing if we're talking about leniency or understanding the root of the halacha here, because, Shayna, for me, there aren't that many, but the moments where personal hygiene and halacha clash for me are existential for me. I am what the Gemara would call an itztanist, okay? I'm a bit of a clean freak, definitely in my home in particular. It's not recommended, by the way. I don't recommend it. If you receive this gene probably from your mother, it's really best to try and stamp it out of you. It's not helpful when wasting children. But in any event, it is what it is. That's the situation. And the truth is that years ago, I think once I already had about like three kids, when like the amount of laundry was just, I couldn't imagine what it would look like now with 5, but I thought it was a lot of laundry then. And it's really overwhelming for me. It like totally is, it's really a challenge. Like it's that moment where I feel internally like an internal suffering kind of thing. You can laugh at it, but it's a truth. It's how I experience it.
I hear you.
And I imagine that I'm not alone. And therefore, I went looking around to understand like what is sitting at the root of this. And I ended up not only in this issue, but in many issues, falling into the Torah of the Psak Halacha of Reb Nachum Rabinovich, who Alav Shalom, who passed away 5 years ago, who was originally Canadian-born, but really is almost not known at all outside of Israel, and served as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Birkat Moshe, or the Mele Adumim Hesed Yeshiva, as it's usually called, until his death. But before that, he was the head of the London School of Jewish Studies. He actually, somewhat famously, was Rabbi Sax's halachic teacher. He quotes him all the time. And Rabbi Rabinovich was unusual for so many reasons. We're not going to do an episode about him, but he's a little bit...
We will definitely come back to quoting him.
We'll come back to him. He's one of my rabbinic heroes, honestly. And he has an amazing ability to have modern sensibilities without being compromising on his halachic loyalty. And he also had a very, very kind sense of women and women's issues that comes up in so many different tshuvot of his. And so I just want to say that in his tshuva, he writes about the topic of all of these minhagim and halachot of the 3 weeks, that he speaks about this idea that both that the bath is really, then it was luxurious, and we're not talking about luxurious bathing today, but also about laundry. And he actually is completely makil on this topic and says that the only isur is to have, like, I would almost say like a dry cleaning, like a special laundering process for clothing that is chashuv. And if you look in the base in the Gemara, and also specifically Tosfot, they're also on these sugiot in the Gemara, it was talking about the fact that they would launder publicly, right? People used to launder things outside of their home and then hang them. And we didn't want like a cultural norm of everybody going along their business naturally. But in today, where people are doing their laundry privately, and I can't look at you, Shayna, and know if you've laundered your clothing anytime in the recent past. So that is not a problem. He says also wearing cleanly laundered clothing and also doing laundry during up to the 9 days. And he says that very clearly. Now, that is definitely on the lenient spectrum of this idea. But I also just want to bring it up because if there's somebody who utterly hates the 3 weeks because this is something that is painful for her or him, I just want you to know that there are opinions out there. I'm not talking about being posek shopping. I think there's a conversation to be had halachically, but I do just want to bring it up because for me, while I don't fully imbibe all the leniency that he permits in his tshuva, there are elements of it that I have utilized for just my own sanity during this time period.
I think it's so important that you're bringing it up. First of all, people should be aware of the spectrum of psak that's out there. First of all, because it's out there and we want to be intellectually honest. Yeah. Second of all, because we shouldn't look around and judge our neighbors who we see doing things differently than us and think that they're not halachic. It could be that they're following a different approach or have a different, attitude or posek or whatever it is. And it's not because they don't care or because they don't take this seriously. And also because there are situations, depending on the person or depending on the specific circumstances, where even somebody who, wouldn't necessarily turn to this specific posek may need to make use of something like that. So it's interesting, like between us, these things don't bother me on that existential level. Yeah. Maybe because I made Aliyah with a really big machines from America. So like I could do a ton of laundry at once and I'm not doing it every other day. Like sometimes people in Israel are like, I do it more or less like once a week or whatever, a couple of big loads. Maybe because I like make sure that my kids have tons of like underwear and socks and like we're never like, down to the last pair. So like it doesn't come up in that way. And yet there are times where like it's been a big issue. Like I remember one of my sons came home from a 3-week sleepaway camp in the middle of the 9 days and like all his stuff was disgusting and like smelly and you're like, really? I have to wait like a week to wash this, or you have a huge Shabbat with tons of company and there's so much, so many sheets and linens to wash and things like that, where I think it is, sometimes important to know that there are leniencies that are out there. At the same time, as you said, it's important to speak cautiously about this because we're not recommending posek shopping and we're not in the mindset of people just looking to do what's easiest for them or to get out of something. It's more in terms of like knowing how to have an open and balanced conversation and to know when to employ these different psakim at the right times. And that's part of why, could be important to talk to somebody, a halachic authority, or to talk it through with someone, because I think the halacha knows how to make use of these things when it's important to. One more area also that I want to bring up here is the prohibition of eating meat and drinking wine during the 9 days, or again for Sephardim, Shavua Shechalbo, which may, not be relevant this year. But for people who have like meat or chicken every night for dinner, or who enjoy a nice glass of wine.
Or lunch if you're in Israel.
Yeah, or lunch, true. Or enjoy a nice glass of wine at the end of the day. Or these halachot are very significant. And again, accentuating the mourning and the loss that we are supposed to feel during this time period. And yet here also, it's interesting because the halacha says that if somebody makes a siyam because they finished learning a tractate of Gemara, Masechet, or they finished some other, big learning project, then they're allowed to make a special meal, what's known as a Sudat mitzvah, where they could eat meat. And there's interesting conversation about should somebody on purpose delay finishing something that they were on the verge of finishing just so that they can make a siyam during the 9 days? That the Aruch HaShulchan does not look kindly on, that someone's specifically pushing off the end of their learning. And yet he says if somebody decides to learn something specifically so that they can make a siyam, he's in favor of that as an incentive, to learn Torah. He says, but it should only really be for people who are also learning Torah, only those people should be invited. And he, seems to want us again to find the right use of this, which, and I'll note also, but very meaningfully, that women also, poskim say, can be making siyumim that could enable others to eat meat. But similar to the discussion I mentioned that I've had with my children about a cappella music, there are a lot of conversations about the role that these siyumim should play. Should there be a huge siyum with a massive barbecue every night? Should people throw a party? They're inviting all kinds of people that they wouldn't necessarily typically invite so that they could eat meat. It really ties into this bigger question that we're getting at, which is, what is the underlying purpose of these halachot? I deeply appreciated Dr. Erica Brown, who I very much enjoy her writings. She has a book called In the Narrow Places, based on the phrase Bein HaMitzarim, which is book of daily inspiration for the 3 weeks. And she reminds us, as we should be reminded, that the goal of these halachot is to help us structure our lives during this time period in a way that really helps us minimize the joy and the happiness and be able to reflect on the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. And she writes there that the laws themselves don't automatically help us recall the past or enable us to connect emotionally. It's what we do with them. And sometimes in both directions, meaning sometimes we could kind of be looking for loopholes and be trying to get around them. And because of the halachic technicalities, we could kind of make them irrelevant. And that's one way where the laws could end up not really serving the purpose that they're supposed to. And on the other hand, and we see this definitely also in communities where they become something that people obsess over, or they're so immersed in the minutia of the details that they're kind of missing the bigger picture of what the point is of these halachot. So I think it's so important that we really make an effort for ourselves, for our children, for our students, to really try to tap into the meaning behind this time period. And it's not simple, especially in today's day and age. I mean, I grew up every summer in the Catskills. My parents had a home there. And in the Catskills, the 9 days is an Irua, meaning it's an event. It's every restaurant there has different deals or 9-day specials. And definitely the dairy, places are advertising all kinds of interesting special menus. And there's places that have meat, siyumim, and barbecues, and there's a cappella groups that perform or things like that, where it's the spirit of the law sometimes seems to be lacking, So on the one hand, we need to know what's halachically okay and whatever, and what's not. And on the other hand, even if people wouldn't dare violate any of the formal halachot, I think the discussion about how do we make these days meaningful, how do we make these days count, is important. And for that discussion, there's things beyond the halacha that also help. These halachot definitely engender part of what helps contribute to a certain mood. But I think there's things beyond that that could help us really experience these days in the ways that we're meant to.
I totally agree with you. The commercialization of these days is something also that's far less present in Israel. I just also want to say that, like, it does. We don't have the same concept of commercialization don't happen here. It's not as deeply part of the culture. There definitely is music that can come out, but more than that, it's not really something you see as much. And I will say that there is also pretty easy access to a whole host of experiences here that can make this experience, this time of year, meaningful, right? Any kind of visiting all the amazing, sites in Yerushalayim, in the Old City, in Ir David. We definitely as a family try and do something of that sort, like during this time period. I think that all of the different kinds of tours and activities one can do in Yerushalayim, let's say, and again, not everyone is living close to Yerushalayim in Israel, so that also would require some sort of, travel. But that I would say is kind of low hanging fruit. And if I would be honest, Shayna, that for my oldest daughter's bat mitzvah, which was almost a year ago, we went for the first time as a family to Har Bayit. We went up as a family. And since then, it's kind of become like our new family religious activity. My husband grew up in Yerushalayim. He was always a very big kotel person, and it's kind of been supplanted at this point. So he's been, I think, 5 times in the past year, and I went twice. So that is something that we definitely plan to do as a family as well. That is obviously not for everybody, not giving any piskei halacha, but I'm just saying that for us, it's been a very meaningful piece here that actually makes Tisha B'Av feel like a much more organic part, actually, of our year-long experience, because the awareness of what we don't have is actually very clear in that space. It's been very powerful for us as a family to do that, and we've taken all of our kids, and they've gone more than once, but that to me has been very meaningful, and it's not so complicated.
Yeah, I think we are lucky here in Israel that there's easy access to these kind of things, not only like the Old City and the Kotel, and for people who do go up to Har Bayit, like obviously that very, very intense direct experience, but even museums like Machon HaMikdash, or places that highlight exactly what was this Beit HaMikdash? Yeah. Why was it so important? Why was it so central to life here? And I think in Chutz La'aretz, obviously it's not, you don't have as many concrete ways to access that, but still the discussion around what's lacking today? What are we missing? Because for all the people that come to Israel and that visit the Old City and that stay in beautiful hotels and that are in Yerushalayim or whatever, like what's still missing here? Like what don't we have? And how can we highlight that? So that's definitely something that helps make this time of year meaningful. I think also what we choose to read, what we choose to engage in, whether it's things from Tanakh, like some of the Parshiot in Sefer Dvarim or Sefer Yirmiyahu, which talks about the Nivuot, the prophecies that had to do with the destruction and with the exile. Eicha, commentaries on Eicha, wonderful books, like Dr. Yael Ziegler has a fantastic book about Eicha that is so deeply relevant. The Midrashim that exist on the Megillah of Eicha, Agadata in Gittin, all the Agadata about the time period of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the Sinat Chinam that exists in the different stories that help explain what was going on historically at that time period. And there's some great books also in Hebrew, Amavda Aretz from Rabboni Kamazon, from Lutniel, like that really delve into these things. Yeah, where's our minds? Like what's our mindset? What are we engaged in? Whether it's reading or singing or...
Totally. By the way, I also just want to say, here I'm in the hat of parent for a moment, that there's a tremendous amount of phenomenal material for kids. I am more connected to the Hebrew side because that's natural for my children. And if anyone's listening, and you can reach out to us, and I'm happy to share. There's a massive chain that goes around every year with like podcasts and episodes, but also just go back that Ir David, or you can write in English, Megalim. They have a series of excellent videos, and they have it also dubbed in English that I've been showing my kids from like a very young age that are also just helpful.
That really help bring the time period of the Mikdash alive.
Here we have like puzzles, and we have like models of the Beit Mikdash. We also like utilize that with our kids, but that I think is significant. Shayna, as we're describing all of these, putting ourselves into this space of mourning, So I'm also thinking honestly about the spaces we've been in Israel in the past, more than a year and a half at this point. One thought I have, Shayna, and as we're sort of like surfacing all of these great tools and also speaking about the halachot, is that sometimes we have this experience in our religious lives where a halachic season or a religious season demands something of us, but that we're not really there at that moment. And, I'm even just thinking about the collision of the mourning that people are experiencing in Israel now, or really even last year also, with this period of the year. It kind of was like, I don't know, do I have space for another a season of mourning? Or sometimes it could be hitting someone in their personal space. Or, I don't know, Shavuot is a time for Matan Torah, for feeling that they're receiving the Torah. But for a whole bunch of personal reasons, someone is like totally not in that mindset. And maybe for them on a random Wednesday, they're going to have a moment where they feel like, wow, I am committed. And this act of receiving has happened. And I just want to say that with all these ideas that we're bringing up, that it's important to recognize that while sometimes we'll go through a season and be like, you know what, I'm fulfilling the halachot, or I'm trying my best to fulfill the halachot, but emotionally, I'm not actually capable of being in that moment. And often I look at these seasons as an opportunity. Like our Jewish calendar is calling upon us to have certain values, and the values are transmuted through the halachic ideas that are trying to remember different time periods and recreate them in our lives. But we're not always emotionally available for it. And therefore, I often look at it more as like an opportunity. I mean, I'm going to be committed to the halachic life, right. But it's okay. It's okay if this year I wasn't able to be present for that. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yeah, it's not mandated, you're saying. Yeah. Like similar to what we discussed last episode about whether things are mandated. The halacha doesn't mandate. They mandate the halachic aspects, but in terms of like where you go with it, which is almost like a little bit the opposite of what we were saying before, of like you have to find the meaning. Yeah. But you're saying you have to find the meaning in a way that is appropriate for you and where you are right then and there. If it's too much right now, or if you're not feeling it the way you want to, or your heart is just not able to hold that right now. I relate to that. There's been so much heaviness and so much sadness and so much pain sometimes you're just like, I can't, like I can't go there right now. And at the same time, I do feel like this time period is a little bit about, I don't know, like focusing or like putting our finger specifically on like a very specific kind of loss that's different than all the sadness and pain or whatever, or maybe like more, like just more specific, more particular. And I don't want to totally let go of that. Like I want to find room, for that also. But maybe you could speak a little bit more, because I think the two of us are sitting here in Israel, and sometimes like when you're not here and you hear about the loss. So there's the loss of life, obviously. So many precious soldiers and so many even civilians now during this last attack with Iran. And there's definitely the loss of life that we've experienced, which is so painful. But I think the loss, as you were saying earlier, loss is not only people, and mourning isn't only people. So if you could speak a little bit more to like some of the other things that we've been experiencing here.
Goodness, where should I begin? I mean, I think that the loss of equilibrium, of a sense of routine, is something that I mean, it's like been on steroids in the past while. I mean, as we're sitting here and kiviyachol, we're calmer because we're not in the active war with Iran right now. But like my brother-in-law is sitting in Gaza right now, meaning there's so many parallel reality. He's been there for weeks. He has a 7-week-old new child, meaning like there's, it's everything.
We're still woken up by sirens from the
2 nights ago. Exactly. Yeah. I was non-functional yesterday because I just had terribly interrupted sleep. Exactly. So like there's a lot of parallel realities going on at the moment. And it's been like this never ending practice, and how to like create routine in the face of lack of routine, which is like the first coping mechanism that is recommended when people are in like transitional spaces or just like there's a loss of clarity about what's happening. And yes, as you said, there's definitely loss of life, but there has just been a real shaking of a sense of security that I think, different people have processed in different kinds of ways in their life. And I think that for me, where these halachot that we've spoken about, especially that piece by Rav Soloveitchik and what I mentioned in the 5 stages of grief, those ideas present life as happening. Even though she definitely didn't mean it in a certain order, it does present in having some sort of like clear stage element.
Like linear.
It's a certain linear process. And the thing that one of the million of things that has been so challenging about the past while in Israel is that we have not yet been able to gain a sense of before the event and after. Like someone recently was saying, like, I can't have PTSD from sirens because it's just still happening. Meaning
we're not post anything.
And so it's been like this continuous, again, there's tremendous amount of miracles involved. And I'm not discounting any of of what the positive outcome that has happened from all of this challenge. But the sense, there's no sense of linearity. Right. And you don't feel like you're ever emerging from something.
Right. And we've really lost a sense of stability. That sense of like, my kids are like, oh, next week. I'm like, who knows what's going to happen between now and next week? Things are on again. They're off again. They're on again. Weddings that get canceled and rescheduled and canceled, switching locations for things. And even like loss of like real ideas, or beliefs or like things that you just took as like a given, for granted, this is how it's going to be, or even deeper understandings of the world and of politics and of Jewish history and all different kinds of things. So I think you're right.
So much has been like upended. Can I tell you a really funny story, Shayna? I know we both have like a love for a particular beach in this country. And like I think it was 3 days after the war had ended with Iran or whatever ended the ceasefire. Until next time, folks. And it was my birthday. This was right. When we're recording, it was 2 weeks ago, and I just really wanted to go to the beach, and that was like my wish for my birthday. I just wanted my whole family to go together to the beach, and I was like, okay, so we're going to go and it's going to be normal. And we're going to be like a normal family who goes to the beach. And we get to the beach. And well, not only were there also jellyfish, which was a bummer on our time. But as we're there, okay, so we weren't scared that day that there were going to be more sirens. Little did we know that they were going to pick up again. But in the background of us, frolicking with our children, there were insane explosions because it's really close to Gaza, like insane explosions. And now there were a million people there. Nobody jumped. Nobody looked. It was like everybody was determined to have a nice time. We're determined to be normal. Yeah. And it's a crazy thing. Obviously it's the secret to the Israeli resilience in this country, but it's also a little bit like if you stop for a moment to think about it, it's crazy. And it really honed in for me this idea about how there really is no beginning, middle, and end right now. It's all happening at the same time, and you can't escape it.
Yeah, and I want to speak to that a little bit because I've also been feeling like, wow, we are asked to hold so many different emotions and so many different feelings and so many different experiences all together, all at once, all the time. So, right, we were woken up a couple nights ago by a siren at 4 a.m. And that very night, the whole yeshuv here in Alon Shvut was out at like a big concert. You would never know like what people are going through and they're in it all at once. And I think a little bit, that gives me a little bit of insight of like what this time is supposed to be, because we've learned to kind of live with loss being there like as the backdrop to our lives in a pretty constant way. Sometimes we feel it more, sometimes we feel it less, sometimes we really, really want to connect it and like we want to just let ourselves fall apart and cry. Sometimes we just can't hold it right now and we want to shut it out. You see also at weddings that we've gone to, like how different people like want to incorporate this time period and the feelings that they are experiencing and the loss or the mourning of friends into their chuppah. So, I was at a wedding where they used the Kiddush cup of a friend who had fallen. I was at another wedding where under the chuppah, they sang a very intense song of Min HaMitzar, which was written by friends of the Chatan. And then a minute later, it's like the exuberant happiness and joy. And it's not one or the other. They really coexist. And I think that could also help us understand, like, right, it's the summer for many, many people, at least if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the summer and it's vacation and it's camp and it's fun or whatever. And it's not all or nothing. It's not like either we're sitting on the floor saying keynote and, crying, or we are, I don't know, having color war. We can find ways during the 3 weeks and the 9 days to bring in that backdrop of like the loss of the Beit HaMikdash and whatever, even as we are, whatever, going about our daily activities in camp. And this also connected me to another, like, that's an underlying feeling that I have. And it connected me also to another underlying perspective that I read about in this fascinating little book. Okay, it's called This Is Real, and You Are Completely Unprepared. It's about the days of awe, the Yamim Noraim, as a journey of transformation. It's primarily about like a spiritual guide to take you through the Yamim Noraim, like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But he actually, very interestingly, the author's name is Alan Liu, he starts the book at Tisha Bav, which I found fascinating. And he writes that there are two ways of looking at the way our tradition has collapsed history on this day. Two ways of thinking about this conflation of calamity. We could regard the 9th of Av and the week surrounding it as a cursed time, which is what we were talking about, the Bein HaMitzarim and more, likelihood or for danger or bad things happening. Or we could regard the 9th of Av as a time when we are reminded that catastrophes will keep recurring in our lives until we get things right, until we learn what we need to learn from them. Meaning he's taking the perspective that not only are catastrophes like these external things that kind of like fall upon us and these calamities that happen, he's basically saying that part of what we are supposed to be taking away from this time period is that tragedies happen, but what we do with them afterwards, what we take from them, the tikkunim, like the things that we fix or the things that we understand or what we need to learn from them, is on us, And that I thought was really interesting because he's connecting that to the bigger tshuva process that's crazy to think is around the corner. But the month of Elul and Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Yemei Teshuvah and Yom Kippur, it's quickly approaching. And in our sources, we know there's a tradition that right after Tisha B'Av, we start reading these Sheva Din Nechemta, these 7 Haftorot that bring us from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah. So it's not crazy that like he's connecting these time periods. And basically, I think what we're seeing here is that, they're not totally separate. Like we know one of the main reasons that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed was because of the sinat chinam, the baseless hatred, or other different kinds of sins that Bnei Yisrael were engaged in. And we have to understand that this is not something that we're powerless in. Like it doesn't have to be that every year, year after year, the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av are a given part of our calendar. Maybe we could change that destiny. Like maybe if we actually focused on the meaning and not just the nitty-gritty halachot, and we said, wait, whoa, what are we supposed to take away from this? Maybe somehow we as a nation could break out of this never-ending loop of the calendar year. We could change our destiny. Sometimes Dafke says, like, when walls fall down, and when things are destroyed and like the structure comes, apart, there's also an opportunity. There's an opportunity to kind of see where we want to move forward from there. And one other quote that really, really, really like just hit me in such a meaningful way was from Yael Ziegler's book on Lamentations, on Eicha, Faith in a Turbulent World. The very, very last paragraph of the entire book, her conclusion. These are the final sentences that she writes. The experience of loss represents an opportunity to dig deeper into the nature of humankind and its relationship with God. Suffering produces introspection, and an examined life generates purposeful existence. As it turns out, calamity does not necessarily destroy one's convictions. Instead, it can enable one to discover them. The experience of adversity can foster faith in a turbulent world. And I think definitely in the last 2 years, we very much feel like that there's been so much adversity and so much suffering and so many challenges. And yet you see people tapping into meaning and into strength and into idealism and into like new convictions in a way that maybe they didn't necessarily feel before. And I think
that the image of the walls falling down is, also was obviously a very it's a
very real.
Yeah, very real image. But I think that very much, I wanted to say that you see that it has birthed other things. It has birthed other kochot. And I would even say, within ourselves, Shayna, like you and I, we both know. I mean, how I responded to something that I perceived as threatening 3 years ago was not how I respond to it today. Meaning I have definitely been able to tap into reservoirs of resilience that were fortified by what we've been through. And I agree with you that as a people, we definitely should be able to do something similar. And that we don't have to have Tisha Bav, right? It doesn't have to be there. It's also a question of what the future looks like. I also just wanted to respond to one other thing and say that anybody who's listening, who's experienced the loss of a close loved one in their life, whether a family member or friend or whatever it is, and I lost my father at this point 8.5 years ago. The idea of living alongside loss is the name of the game.
Totally.
It's what it is. That's what it becomes. It's something that's, all consuming or kind of swallows you up. And then the goal is to get to a space where it's there, it exists, it's a hole in your heart or wherever you imagine loss living. And then you have a life that is living alongside of it. So we're having our summer season, trying to have a routine with our families and our friends, etc. But alongside that, we're also trying to experience this thing, right? This period of our, as I call it, halachic season, that it be meaningful and that it not be a mandate. That maybe in the future it can look different if we can be bold enough to reimagine it.
Yeah. And I think, we try to end with a takeaway.
Yeah.
And I think that's mine. I'm thinking about the opportunity that these days give us to pause, to stop, to reflect, to really grieve, not just to get through the 9 days, but to really be in them and to cry for all that's lacking in our world. I think it's a really powerful time to connect to what it means that we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, what it means that the Shekhinah is not amongst us in that same intense, powerful way that it was meant to be, what that represents in our world, all the pain that brings with it, and how connecting to some of these halachot or some of these concepts and the deeper meaning can also help us better connect to ourselves, to Am Yisrael, and to our relationship with Hashem at this time.
Yeah, I think for me, you briefly mentioned it earlier, but this piece about the present or the current Yerushalayim versus what we want it to look like is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. There's also a tefillah that was written. I actually believe it was by Rav Rabinovich, wasn't it?
I'm not sure.
But a tefillah that many people say in Shemona Esrei because sort of the regular tefillah that we say on Tisha B'Av, right, of Nachem, is doesn't really describe the way that Yerushalayim looks today. And so there's actually another tefillah that others say in the religious Zionist world more primarily. And this piece about what is it that we want Yerushalayim to look like? How could we get there? What does that kind of movement look like is, I think, something that I'm definitely thinking about more in this season of my life. So I think that's something that, we can explore either up close and from afar. There's so many ways, virtual ways, to be connected in that kind of way if we choose that channel of connection throughout this period of time. There was so much to discuss. There are many other halachot. There's halachot of fasting. Halachot of fasting for women at different stages of their life also has a tremendous variance. And so we also really encourage everyone listening to check out more of the articles on the website if they want to, and of course to consult with their authorities.
Barely touched on Tisha Bav itself and on Eicha and ways to make Eicha meaningful. There's women's readings. There's different ways, that people could experience Eicha in a way that really makes it real for them.
Yeah, even if you're not in camp, because these days can be meaningful, even if you're not in a camp setting. So we encourage you to check that out, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Yes, looking forward.
Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance with all of them. You can contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. That's womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.